Hello everyone and welcome to the second in this year's Toolkits Poetry live broadcasts. We're very lucky this evening to be joined by Jeanine Leane, who will be speaking on the subject Telling Places, Rewriting Histories. So Jeanine and I are broadcasting from the Wheeler Centre based in Naarm, and I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of this land, and their elders past, present and emerging. This is land that was stolen, and this land has been cared for by Wurundjeri and Boon Wurrung people since time immemorial. It is important that we move across this place with great care and respect, and recognise the great strength and knowledge of its First Peoples. Important too is the recognition of the ongoing violence of dispossession and ongoing attempts at genocide as a result of colonisation. I ask also that everyone tuning in takes the time to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that they're currently tuning in from. Jeanine Leane is a Wurundjeri writer, poet and academic from southwest New South Wales. Her first volume of poetry, Dark Secrets After Dreaming, AD, chapbook here, 1887 to 1961, won the Scanlon Prize for Indigenous Poetry in 2010, and her first novel, Purple Threads, published by UQP, won the David Uniacke Award for an unpublished Indigenous writer in 2010, and was shortlisted for the 2012 Commonwealth Book Prize and the Victorian Premier's Award for Indigenous Writing. Her poetry and short stories have been published in Hecate, an interdisciplinary journal of women's liberation, the Journal for the Association of European Studies of Australia, Australian Poetry Journal, Antipodes, and the Australian Book Review. Jeanine has published widely in the area of Aboriginal literature, writing otherness and creative non-fiction. In 2017, Jeanine was the recipient of the Wurundjeri Prize, Poetry Prize, and the University of Canberra Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Poetry Prize. She teaches creative writing and Aboriginal literature at the University of Melbourne. The manuscript for her second volume of poetry, Walk Back Over, to this book here, was highly commended in the Black and White Indigenous Writing Fellowships, State Library of Queensland, 2016, and was released in 2018 by Cordite Press. Thank you so much, Jeanine, for joining.
Thank you.
I'll pass over to you, and I'll come back on at the end with some questions, a short Q&A. Please tweet us your questions using hashtag #ENToolkits. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Melody. Hello and welcome, everyone. I too would just like to acknowledge that that I'm speaking from and that we're gathered here on the lands, on the Kulin Nation, and on Aboriginal land that was never ceded, and say welcome. Yeah, as Melody mentioned, I'm from the Wurundjeri people of southwestern New South Wales, which is where the Murrumbidgee River is, near Gundagai, and that river is a very important river in the lives of my people and in my life as well. I'm a freshwater person, and Wurundjeri people are bordered by those three rivers, the Murrumbidgee, the Gallara, and the Wamble. And I was fortunate enough to grow up on country, and to grow up with two generations of women, my grandmother and my aunties and my mother, and that was probably the single most important grounding for my writing, for my life more broadly. But I'm here today to talk about how is poetry and fiction used by Aboriginal writers, myself and other writers, to talk about the histories of place, and to talk about and to retell histories that were forgotten, written over, not forgotten by us, but left out of the colonial archive, written over, or misrepresented. And when you think about Australian Aboriginal history, there's, or the colonisation of Australia more broadly, there's a lot there that has been completely written over, but I'm not going to say destroyed or lost, because I was never raised to think I lost my culture or that it was destroyed. I learned to live in a different sort of way where we transmitted culture a bit differently through the home and through a lot of secrets and stories. And later as an adult, I realised how underrepresented those stories were. Although I was always conscious of it at the time, I guess as an adult, I felt that I had been part of that generation that was fortunate enough, although at great cost and not always so easily, to access the Western education system. So I use them writing as a way of talking back and as a way of telling the histories of the women who raised me and Aboriginal people more broadly. I think that need to be told. So I work a lot with reclaiming what I call kidnapped memories and writing back to the colonial history of the past, but not all my writing or not all Aboriginal writing is reactionary. I want to be very clear about that too. Although the writing is my own writing is also celebratory. It's also celebrates the resilience and the creativity, the resistance and the intellectual sovereignty, I think, of Aboriginal people today and forward. And I also want to talk a bit today about working with memory and anecdote, because Melody mentioned 2 poetry books I'd written and also one, not sure if you call it a novel or a collection of stories. It's been much debated, and that in itself is an interesting thing about Aboriginal writing. It doesn't always fit neatly into the categories of a Western genre, like fiction or non-fiction or autobiography or memoir. Much of what I've written talks about the problems of trying to just neatly squeeze our stories and our history into these Western genre categories that are quite predetermined and quite rigid. So my first collection of poetry, for example, which was called Dark Secrets After Dreaming, AD 1887 to 1961, and it's like a small chapbook, as you can see, but it contains like 17 or 19 poems that are in a historical sequence that start with my grandmother's story as she told bits and pieces of it to me, and moves through some of the quite shocking experiences of early contact and colonialism. I describe the book as a collection of poems that tells the story of women's experience from after dreaming 1887, which is when my grandmother was born, to 1961 when I was born. So the dates are quite significant, and it's inspired by anecdotal and family stories from Wurundjeri women, and it moves from campfire to captivity to confinement and through colonialism. And that book's available through a small publisher called Press, and you can buy it online. But it's a way of, in particular, it's poetry, but I also want to emphasise that it's history, and a lot of Aboriginal poetry does that work. A lot of Aboriginal literature does the work that history history with a capital H, I mean national history or official history, just doesn't do and won't ever do for us. History will never do it for us. We can only do it ourselves through stories. So writing poetry for me is also about unlearning and freeing myself from the confines of Western rationalism that tells me that I shouldn't believe in presences and spirits and voices of the dead and the past, but the past speaks all the time. And I have a right to, because those voices, those presences have something to say. And the women who raised me, I mentioned my grandmother, and Dark Secrets is a lot of her story. Who raised me were very conscious of listening to voices of past loved ones and the past itself, and listening to the land as well, because before print literacy, before reading, Aboriginal people were highly environmentally literate. And the settler population isn't always. And I write a lot about that in Purple Threads, which was the collection or the memoir that I wrote, set around Gundagai, which is my country. But yeah, the women who raised me listened to voices and the past, and you know, it's another form of imperialism that Western education has tried to impose upon me and Aboriginal people more broadly, is to reject that, is to not believe in it. So I see writing, the writings of Aboriginal poets like Ali Kobe-Eckermann, for example, Evelyn Araluen, Helen Van Neven, Alison Whittaker, Carrie Reid Gilbert, Yvette Holt, Elizabeth Hodgson, Natalie Harkin, who I'll be reading a little from in a minute, Lisa Belair, Charmaine Green, and I'm so conscious that that list is not exhaustive. But there's quite a string there of Aboriginal women poets who assert a form of intellectual sovereignty. And I say to people, like, true country comes from the heart now. So much of the land's been occupied, but true country can still carry it in your heart, and true freedom comes from your mind. So I have that in mind when I write, intellectual sovereignty, I guess. So I'm going to start off by sharing a poem with you called Gatherers, and it's in this book called Offshoot, which was published by Western Australia UWA Press, and the subtitle for the book is Offshoot, Contemporary Life Writing Methodologies and Practice. And I really like this book, I really like this title, because it's a book that combines poetry, short story, creative short story, fiction and essay, and considers all those forms that I just said, poetry, short story, creative non-fiction, the personalised essay, as all forms of writing life, or life writing, that move very much away from those traditional forms of autobiography or memoir, which are far too individualised to write Aboriginal stories or to write the kind of stories that I want to write, because I'm conscious of the fact that when I was writing Dark Secrets, when I was writing Purple Threads, that I was the medium, I was the one lucky enough to receive the stories and be empowered enough to do something with them. But they're not just my stories alone. They belong to other women in my family and to earlier generations, and they came with a lot of wisdom and a lot of responsibility. So there's a great deal of ethics involved in writing those stories and talking to those people living who are still left before you even decide to write them. But I'm going to share with you this poem called Gatherers, and it's from Offshoot, and it's a non-fiction poem. And it's a poem where I was brave enough for the first time to empower myself to use some language. And it also tells an important story of continuance and memory. It's a long-ish poem, but it's okay. I'll read it slowly. And you'll hear the language in the poem. Gatherers. Grandmother learnt to gather, map country with little feet, as morning's pink horizons bring heat and light to Longwater, Murrumbidgee. Women gather in the early air when dewdrops from frond and leaf, where midbrilongs nesting in hollow gum sings the new day, and Wairu warbles, and Mullian soars high above the majestic. Biami watches, and the Bullagangs and their wide-eyed bellies cooing on their hips of gunnies as they gather under the watchful eyes of Ballagans, skilled with time and wise with age, custodians of place, keepers of secrets, of women teaching young minis and minigans the law of the land. Ululu marks time, rises high, burns country Cobar red. Migays forage for gutty and nurrung and catch warumbu by Wurundjeri shores. Net marmanung and gadu of clear water and dig for kumbudgery in the marshes and gather budiang's eggs among the reeds and search for budung among the miniature mountains of moss. Grandmother learns to look for small things that matter. Take carefully, leave some always. To gather is to share. Grandmother learnt to weave under the shade of Udadi, where Wurrung blows hot and dry across the plains, and Ululu's tangent moves above, turning time and tide, and grandmother watches the nimble fingers of Migay's twine and loop, braiding stories with reeds and grasses gathered, weaving words of wisdom with baskets and dillies, crafting kulamons to learn that trees do not bleed when bark is taken. They give, share, bear the scar to remember, to remind us to always take carefully, gather only what is needed, gather to return, return to gather. As steady hands sift through earthy archives, grandmother learns to sow the seeds gathered, to return to country what it gave. To gather is to release. She listens, gathers stories, reads them in the land she walks. Wirriga softly, the Bullagans tell her. Tread carefully on country, they say. Balamu always watching, the ancient ones, dead, not gone. Their blood flows through us, gathers us. Listen, the dead speak all the time. Ululu's rays fade to deep red Girigaram. Arana's pale face peeks out from behind the hills. Muddying is gathered, fires are lit. Budiang swirls milky white across the dark sky. Night's black blanket swaddles the Nurung circle beneath chunky white blazing stars. Karkor croaks a lullaby. Ululu rises and sets. Arana waxes and wanes. Turns day to night. Bayami watches. Grandmother grows from Warragay to Ninambro. She learns to gather secrets, things that only women know and keep deep in the storage vessels of memory, the seamless baskets of the mind, where what is woven will never unravel. Grandmother becomes Wingadan and teaches her children to gather, to store history in the safe hands, to share and to gather again. Colonial collectors come, steal and kill, and gatherers dispersed, hunted, herded, collected as artefacts, recorded as anthropology, listed in catalogues, displayed as scientific specimens, exhibits A to Z of the primitive, snapped up by Clutch's camera for Basedo's missing link. Gatherers are collected, amassed, classified, arranged in order of hierarchy, white to black. All grandmothers become scattered words on pages in someone else's collection. Collections do not give back what they take. Everything is collected but memory that was gathered, stored and kept. Grandmother cradles secrets between the walls that capture her, sees her history manhandled and watches like a silent prisoner in someone else's story, as everything else is pillaged except for that held in the intricately deep woven basket of her mind. And no man lays claim to this. Grandmother listens for the Barramalal. Only the white man thinks the dead can't speak, and she hears them, and they speak of what can't be stolen. Granddaughters listen to the gatherings buried safe as seeds in the country of grandmother's memory. Like the women before us, we look for small things, listen for silences, gather and gather again, restore, regenerate, remember. That poem says a lot about what I'm about, and it says a lot as a poem about a particular history, the way that history was taken, manhandled, the way we were classified, and the way I speak about dismembering. And when I'm going to read a little bit of an essay now called Gathering and the Politics of Memory in Contemporary Aboriginal Women's Writing. And it is more powerful when you see this on the page, because the way I've written remember is like in 2 words with the re hyphen and then member, because the past was very dismembered, and the job here of me as a poet, I think, is to remember it and then remember. So my focus is always around narrative poetry and prose testimonials by Aboriginal women writers that interact with the archive. But I'm using the term archive really broadly here. Derrida defined an archive, he's a Western French philosopher, as something much broader, but also including the storehouses of official paperwork, the buildings that we think are archives, libraries and records, but also voices from the past that recall and remember trauma and resilience. And a North American scholar, Indigenous scholar called Chadwick Allen, has a term called blood memory. And blood memory is part of the Aboriginal body. And I use Chadwick's work as a lot as well, because I see our bodies as an archive where memories are etched and stored and anchored. And this is the living archive that I inherit. And my mind and my body becomes a repository of my family's history, even before it was told to me. And even now, some of it is still missing and remains untold. There's a lot of gaps in many of the lives of my family. Things missing from times that my grandmother spent in an institution, things not recorded, things that were quite simply too painful for people to talk about some of the experiences of my aunts in domestic service. So, but these things, whether they're told to me or not, the trauma and the memories are still encrypted. That's blood memory. And thus for me, the politics of memory is to remember a dismembered but still living past as it haunts and pervades the lives, my life, in the present. And so I have this term called memory politics, and I define that as transgenerational. Memory politics is beyond the span of a lifetime, and is the greater body politic of Aboriginal memory. We had ways of gathering and storing and communicating and transmitting our histories long before the invasion, and the intervention of the state archive and its wide and wavering nets, its infrastructure, the archives, and the capital H history. National history and the archiving of all things Aboriginal has just been one of the many interventions and invasions into the lives of Aboriginal people. There was, of course, the original invasion of 1788, but that's been followed by a series of no less significant, pernicious interventions and invasions into the lives, lands, and bodies of Aboriginal people. I think not enough has been said about the invasions of the bodies. And attempts to invade our minds as well. So the living archive of our families and their stories is for the most part a complete contrast to the state archives, the records. And the 3 generations of women who raised me, that's including my generation up until debatable, early 70s, I guess. 3 generations of women who raised me never really lived outside the control of the state. And as Noongar writer Natalie Harkin, whose poetry book Dirty Words, published by Cordite Press, I highly recommend, and her essay called, which I think has been distributed, but it's called The Poetics of Remapping the Archives, Blood in Memory. Natalie expresses it this way. She said, state acts of civilians recording and archiving had the power to place our family stories in the public domain or obliterate our stories within the broader histories of erasure, filed away and silent and hidden until bidden. In my experience, the state archives does both. It makes public and it conceals. And what it makes public is a picture of Aboriginal people that it needs to project at any particular moment. So in the case of my family, these historical moments occurred between the late 1880s, when my grandmother first came onto the radar of the state, of the surveillance, and to the 1960s, when this type of surveillance in the lives of Aboriginal people was replaced by a different type of surveillance. And then that's the significance of the dates on this book as well, the poetry. So what the archive conceives and obliterates are the people beyond the paper, filed away in the cardboard boxes, stored in the cold vaults in the basements of buildings. These places are prisons of Aboriginal history that attempted to incarcerate our memories of blood and country. Just want to pause there too now and offer you a definition of what country means for Aboriginal people, which is, and we write it with a capital C, and it's not like a drive in the country. Australia is a nation of many countries. If you haven't already, you should look at Horton's map of Aboriginal Australia with all the different colours on it. And different shapes, because each one of those is a country in its own right, and a language and a people. And so Australia is a modern nation that's invaded many countries. And country for Aboriginal people means more than just land. Country means a place, the place to which one belongs through heritage. Like I belong to the Wurundjeri people. I don't say I'm from them, I say I belong to them. I belong to the Wurundjeri people, the Murrumbidgee River, and my country is Wurundjeri, and it embodies land, language, story, and history and culture. And the Wurundjeri country, the Murrumbidgee, is always my country, irrespective of the geographical region where I live now or have lived. So the archives are prisons for Aboriginal people. Just as the official state-operated prison system incarcerates our physical bodies. And the official system has had a particularly devastating effect on Aboriginal populations, but also has the cardboard prison of the state archive. and it's been an active agent of colonial structure, dispossessing, dismembering family histories, memories and stories. And that the cardboard prison has been a significant catalyst for 21st century women's writing is because a lot of Natalie Harkin's work writes about the archive, and her essay, which I highly recommend, is called The Poetics of Remapping the Colonial Archives. I think the way that a lot of Aboriginal women interact with the archive and use poetry and creative writing to tell about the past, to retell history, and to project the future relates to that role of gathering that I read about in the poem, and that as a continuance. Because there's Australian Aboriginal culture is diverse, and Australia is a nation imagined and constructed over many countries, as I said. But across all Aboriginal society, a couple of things are common. We all have dreamings, and one is that the women are all gatherers too. And I think that most people understand the physical role of gathering. The concept to gather is conventionally associated with small things: lizards, insects, bugs, berries, fruits, seeds, tubers, eggs, small ground animals, nectar and wild honey. But it's also the women's job to weave and craft vessels to keep these gatherings in. And women, and these woven, specially crafted vessels that hold the things gathered are cultural metaphors for me, like the memory, and which I'll define as an activity or a process that reflects the underlying values of a culture. And so the process of gathering, collecting and storing in baskets, coolamans and dillies, for example, are cultural metaphors for the collective memories that are at the core of memory politics. I should also mention here, I mentioned gathering, Bruce Pascoe's, Uncle Bruce Pascoe's wonderful book called Dark Emu talks about Aboriginal agriculture, and does a lot to debunk does everything to debunk the settler myth of no sort of agriculture, no sort of cultivation relationship with the land, and I recommend that book. But also want to stress that alongside that was the gathering role of women. So gathering and storing and sharing as an important way of archiving and transmitting family anecdotes, family stories, genealogies, knowledge and secrets was also the job of the women. So they didn't just gather little physical things, which are really important things, because those little things, those little bits of food were the sustenance of the clan too. I want to point that out. Hunts were quite grand, but they didn't happen every day. So gathering, keeping and storing and restoring are not only important literal activities, but they're also important methods of transmission. And the food gathered by women, as I just said, was often the staple of the clan. And although it was most often the hunts that was celebrated in ceremony and song and dance. And so within Aboriginal society, that organised structure, a structure organised very tightly around gender roles, men often presented the public history and representation and commemoration of people and place, and women were the keepers of the private sphere and certain knowledges that remain secret. And I think that's integral to our writing in the present, that role of women. And the colonial government of the day stamped out and outlawed public displays of Aboriginality, corroborees, ceremonies, rites of passage, rituals, burials, traditional marriages, and in particular language. And it was a big deal for me to empower myself with language in the poem I read out earlier, because I didn't have the privilege of growing up with language. And like a lot of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s, we didn't have the opportunity to learn our language at the time, and we should have. Opportunities arise now, and that's good, but I often think about how it feels to have to go back and learn your mother tongue that you should have been able to speak in the first place. But the colonial government of the day did stamp out some of those public practices, but some of the knowledge and stories, but not some of it, quite a lot of the knowledge, stories and secrets gathered and stored by women remained elusive. I referred to that in the poem, things gathered in the baskets and memories of your mind that can't be stolen. And this is what translated to me and to a lot of women who write intergenerationally through stories gathered and stored and then retold again to later generations. And acclaimed one-year writer and author and literary critic Alexis Wright, who is also a really good poet. She's very well known as a novelist, of course, but she's a really good poet. Alexis said that throughout her life she learned how to piece the mysteries together with gathered facts from historical records that have been revealed through anthropological and historical and family research. And she said she can only now feel that she can tell the story of her family, revealing the voices of loved ones who never told a story that they felt too painful and shameful to tell. And I think she speaks really clearly to the role of women as gatherers and also to her engagement with the archive that I spoke about, and the historical record and what is gathered there too, to be reclaimed and to be regathered and to be restored and to be rewritten through the role of the informed imagination of the writer, whose hand is informed by the transgenerational memory to transform and to write, R-I-G-H-T, to make right, and to write, R-I-T-E, the past in a creative and political act. And I mentioned the informed imagination there, and I'll define that for you. It's a term I use, or I made up, to describe the way Aboriginal writers work with bits and pieces of archival information, snippets of story and memory from loved ones, to imagine the gaps missing or left out of the official records, or the memories that were too painful to tell, or the historical fictions and untruths that need to be rewritten. And the imagination is informed by transgenerational memory. That's why I use that term, informed imagination. And I'm going to finish soon with, I'm going to finish on two poems as well. But I think what is not so well understood, and I really want to emphasize this point, is the spiritual transcendental role of women as gatherers and keepers of family histories and knowledge and secrets that come from country. And the politics of memory is to regather and to restore these family histories of trauma and resilience and to restore the nation, Australia, as it sits very shallowly on the surface of our countries and the deeper histories that are there. When my sister and I finally entered a colonial archive in a women's home in Paddington, Sydney, which is no longer there, but the archive became available, where my grandmother spent a year between 1907 and 1908, and we read the history, or part of, but not the real history, the history someone else had written and had control of, not my nana, my aunties, but a warped version of their lives told through the eyes of the state and filed away in a box for the record. I was overwhelmed and overcome with grief and loss and anger. And my response to the archive prison was the following poem, which also appears in this collection that Melody mentioned, Walk Back Over, which is published this year by Cordite Press. And Natalie's really deadly book, Dirty Words, poetry book that I highly recommend, was also published by Cordite Press. It's called Cardboard Incarceration. In this cardboard prison they call an archive is cold, airless and silent as death. Floor-to-ceiling boxes contain voices no longer heard yet still wailing within, and faces no longer seen yet still missing in a jail of captured snippets, images and memories like the severed heads and bleached bones of dismembered bodies neatly locked away in the vaults of museums and universities of the world in the name of science or history or anthropology or something else so important at the time that it justified the collection of bits and pieces of another, the other. We are the inmates incarcerated within these cardboard cells where every neatly dotted I and symmetrically crossed T screams out, read this black angst against these white pages. And I will finish talking and then I'll take some questions. A poem, because I always like to finish with the resilience, and this is also a poem of rewriting history, which is the topic, rewriting history and place, and reclaiming some of the past back. This is a poem called Over the River Memory, and it's written about a bridge in Gundagai, the Prince Alfred Bridge, where I spent a lot of time as a child, and the bridge goes over the river, Murrumbidgee, which is our river. So over the river memory. When I come back, I remember it's been a long time passing since I returned along this track to Gundagai, town of my childhood. There are many ghosts. I hear voices. I stand on a solid red gum bridge, the longest wooden bridge in the world. Irish nuns told me this on a good day under the Gothic arches in the convent on the hill where I learnt about Australian history. This continent, Australia, is a young country, they told us. The history of this place, shortest in the world. They'd seen the world, those nuns. Maps were pinned on the wall, how far they'd travelled to spread their word. I'd only seen country. Longest wooden bridge and the shortest history. That's what I learned. Prince Alfred Bridge, they called it, built last century by pioneers as they opened up our lands for progress. Our teachers said so. How many river gums were felled? What were their names before they were rearranged across the river once their lifeblood? What was their history? My grandmother said, this place is old. She said my teachers don't know the stories. I listened. On a bad day, you could be beaten for asking the wrong questions about the short history of the long bridge. Water under the bridge ripples over my memory now. The bend of the Murrumbidgee, a deep archive, flows steady and slow. I walk on the bridge and remember how long it once took me to cross on little legs, clinging tight to the side rail as huge wheat and wool trucks thundered over ancient planks laden with wealth of the nation. Sometimes the river rose and swallowed the bridge and town. Short history, almost washed away by higher, older tides. No tracks now. The bridge long ago closed. Steel and girders bypass. Steel and concrete girders bypass. The wealth of our nation rumbles along different roads. On the other side, I look back across the floodplains. The old stone convent on the hill is empty. I come back after seeing the world. I hear my grandmother again. The bridge is shorter now, but this history of place, still long and deep. And I'd like to end on that poem because that shows the tremendous resilience and the power of memory to retell a story and to reclaim a place. And just before I do take questions, I also wanted to recommend, I mentioned Alison Whittaker, her wonderful book, Black Work. and which is poetry, prose, essay. It's very, very multi-genre. And also to suggest to you that you look at the Red Room Poetry Project, or the Red Room Poetry, because they've just done a really good project on poetry in first languages, where myself and other poets were empowered to write some poems in language. So I encourage you to check that out. And thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeanine.
Thank you.
That was really great. And thanks so much for reading your work as well.
No problem. Thanks.
Always. So there are sort of these two major areas of concern in your work across your poetry, your work as an educator, as an academic and historian, that being the archive, as well as an interrogation of settler texts. So I wanted to talk to you first about this interrogation of literature, which is something that I really value about your work, is that you're advocating for the reading of work by Aboriginal authors, but you're also pushing for these canonical settler texts not to be done away with.
Yeah, to be reread.
Yeah. So, and you argue that they actually tell us a lot about the violence of the settler narrative that very much still exists, and the way that language, alongside the media and capital H history, constructs how we view Aboriginality, but the types of images of Aboriginality that have been circulated are false and racist, and that we need to stop validating these stories by placing them under scrutiny. So I wanted to talk to you particularly about how this is explored in your poetry. So I'm thinking specifically about your decisions to confront ideas and terms perpetuated in settler literature that are offensive, and also to address particular authors like Patrick White.
I did actually write a poem, particularly in Walk Back Over, about Patrick White. So I'll start with that. Thank you. The poem's called On Cannibals, and Patrick White's work is still canonical. That means, when I describe something as canonical, I mean like it's still taught, it's still valued. If you can, there's a really good database you can look on called Teaching Australian Literature, which shows what are the most popular texts still being taught in of Australian literature in secondary and tertiary classrooms. And Patrick White is still up there as one of those authors. So too is Catherine Pritchard, David Malouf, and Kate Granville, just to name a few people. But yeah, Patrick White, I first encountered Catherine Pritchard's work, Coonadoo, and in high school. And for those of you who haven't read it, it's a 1929 novel set on the Western Australian, in the Kimberley. It's a settler frontier, but it's the very ancient lands of several different peoples, and it's about a large cattle station that's on a particular country up that way, and there's a protagonist is an Aboriginal woman whose name is Coonadoo. And I think when I read that book, I was in year 11, well, we had to read it for our class, and I was the only Aboriginal person in the class. And the images in the book were just so shocking. Like there is this woman portrayed with no intellect. I do highly recommend you read the book and then have a look at some of the essays I did write, particularly one called Tracking, which was published in the Journal for the Association of Australian Literary Studies, or JASL, the acronym, which looks at 5 settler authors and their representations of Aboriginal people, and how that legacy just is still so damaging and still so lasting. But Patrick White, I remember reading Patrick White because we had to read him at university, and his text called A Fringe of Leaves, and this shocking cannibal scene in it, where a white woman participates in cannibalism with a group of Aboriginal people that Patrick White calls the tribe. And Patrick White, as the author, claims to have based his evidence for that story on anecdotal evidence given by Eliza Fraser. And while he argues that he moves away from her once he takes inspiration from her story, there is an extent to which his main female character, whose name's Ellen, takes some lead from that shipwrecked woman. And it was so much described initially as a captive narrative. This white woman captured by Aboriginal people, when in fact she was rescued. Both the real Eliza Fraser and the character in Patrick White's book, they were shipwrecked on someone else's country. Many of the settlers on the shipwreck were lost, and then those surviving were rescued by Aboriginal people, you know, and I'm thinking this is a rescue narrative. And there's a whole body of anecdotal evidence that exists by the Butchulla people, which is Butchulla's place now called Fraser Island, which is case in point. It's called Fraser Island after the shipwreck of Eliza Fraser. And just that one shipwreck and the stories that have transpired since then have swallowed almost a whole history of Butchulla people, an ancient history. And I address that in this poem, which is quite short, but it addresses this particular scene where the white woman swallows, as Patrick White writes it, swallows some flesh and of an Aboriginal woman who's been cooked and eaten, which is really shocking. And ritual cannibalism just was not part of Aboriginal culture. It's purely a figment of European imagination, and I guess that's what I mean when I say these books, they do need to be studied, but the representations need to be turned back on the people who are making them, because what this book says is so much about European fetishes and fantasies, about primitive peoples, about the South Seas, about the global South, and their real desires to actually even find cannibals in these places and prove these wild fantasies of theirs to have some grounding. And that cannibal scene stuck with me, but the cannibal scene, and both in White's book and in Eliza Fraser speaks of it, cannibalism, and there's a whole body of other story evidence out there by the Butchulla people themselves that tell that story quite differently and tell it as the rescue narrative that it was, which Patrick White chose not to listen to.
He denied the opportunity.
He denied the opportunity, yeah, and that's quite well documented in letters, in a book called Letters, which David Marr put together. It's a really good book, actually. It's just a whole complete collection of Patrick White's letters year by year, over probably about a 30-year period of time or so. It's quite extensive, and those letters are quite revealing too about what he was trying to do and why he was wanting to use that story and what he was trying to do with Aboriginal people in his book as well.
Yeah, the power and importance of, particularly in Aboriginal women's poetry, to speak back to these texts is something that's really important. I think of two poems in Alison Whittaker's book, Many Girls, White Linen, which talks back to Picnic at Hanging Rock, and then Love Like Dorothy's,
which talks back to My Country by Dorothea McKellar. Yeah, that's right. There was actually, speaking of that poem by Alison, and you may have seen the volume of Australian poetry last year, the Indigenous volume of Australian poetry that published a number of poems from a segment that has run at a few writers' festivals, and it was called Transforming Country, and it invited several poets. I wrote a response to Dorothea McKellar's poem last year as well for a festival I was invited to in Canberra for their Transforming Country segment. So yeah, that was certainly an interesting segment, but among our Aboriginal poets, Natalie Harkin has a great poem too in Best Australian Poems 2017, which I also recommend. And it has Over the River Memory in it as well that I read. But yeah, Natalie Harkin wrote a poem responding to that as well. Yeah, which is a great poem called Cause Lament or Heart's Lament. Yeah, but it takes a line out of Dorothea's poem that plays on the part about core of my heart, my country. Yeah, and Natalie's poem plays very significantly with that line. Yeah, and I think that's a good example of what I was talking about too, about how we use this intertextual.
And Aboriginal women artists too. I was
the artists,
like Amelia Baker, which I learned about her through a paper from Evelyn Harrow, her racist text installation, which was a floor-to-ceiling stack of books that perpetuate
racist
images of Aboriginal people. Just to wrap up, we've just had a question come through on Twitter from Patrick Kane, who's one of our Toolkit students. And he says, "Thank you for speaking with us, Jeanine. I'd like to hear about what dreaming means to you in your contemporary writing practice."
Dreaming, and thanks. And it's important to say dreaming too instead of dream time, which I appreciate. And I always write it that way. Look, dreaming is part of what comes with country. There are dreaming stories, but I think people misunderstand what they are and what they're meant to be and what is the significance of those. Dreaming stories are very specific to particular places and belong to particular custodians. And some of those are creation stories, why I know what the river is, how the river was made, and what the river does, and how I become literate about the river. I wrote about that in Purple Threads, about the illiteracy of a settler population not being able to read this river when it floods. So what my dreaming really means to me is, even though my grandmother's life she was born in 1887 and under a very early contact colonialism, and spent some time in the institution as well, and didn't have access to all her traditional dreaming stories. What my dreaming means to me is still that my grandmother was able to still connect me with that place. That is the birthplace of her dreaming stories. And so first and foremost, what the dreaming means to me in this contemporary place and to my writing is that connection with place and with people and with history that I know that I'm entitled to and I can always go back to, and that is mine to also transmit to my children, which I do and I'm doing. So I guess to summarize, dreaming means to me it means the empowerment of the stories I've been told and the histories I've been told, and dreaming is a continuous process for me, and it also means having the strength of continuance to be able to draw on those and to write the present.
I think it's a really beautiful place to close.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jeanine. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. That's really something special. And thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thank you.
So please join us for our next and final live session for the year, which will be on Tuesday, October 2nd at 6 p.m. again. We'll be joined by Margan, who will be speaking on writing the self. Okay, thanks everybody. Goodbye.
Bye.